Hello, everyone. Am I audible to all? Yeah. Thank you for making time to join this web talk. I extend a very, very warm welcome to Professor Sheila Jasanoff. I'll introduce her briefly a little later, but first let me take you through the purpose of this web talk series. We are going through extraordinary times across the world. Not just extraordinary, but unprecedented times. And it's quite mind-boggling that a virus has made us realize how humbling this experience has been. At the same time, it's also been a rather humiliating experience because the way in which we are responding to the pandemic requires us to be locked down, a term which is widely used in prisons. So to imprison ourselves to survive on this planet is an unfathomable idea even say a few weeks ago, and yet we are here now in lockdown. At the same time, we are also sort of getting conditioned to a different form of living together in a sense, but are we really living together? It appears in many cities that we are living for ourselves by and large, for our immediate communities, but we really don't know what's happening to the next community and thereafter. So the type of responses that we are getting conditioned to is also fragmenting our humanity in multiple ways. And the state in any nation has by and large responded with a sense of alarm and obviously unpreparedness. The responses of the state have also been extraordinarily hegemonic, if I may use that strong word. And it also has used police powers across the world at a scale which is extraordinary. And we seem to be accepting those police powers. Am I audible? Yeah.
You are, yeah.
Thank you. Because we feel that's probably one of the main ways we can survive as humanity on this planet. And every day brings us news which are more and more disturbing. And while we were, I mean, as everyone is, considering what this means to us at our own, in our own little worlds, Bhargavi, my colleague, and I wondered what it would be for us to imagine a world beyond this. Are we capable of imagining a world beyond this? Now, that very thought itself is frightening because we were not capable of imagining the world we now live in. So in this condition, how can we imagine a world beyond this? As part of Environment Support Group's work, we work with different communities and we work with various leading research organizations across the world. But one of the most remarkable efforts that we have been part of is to be involved with a multi-country research project, which is broadly called the Governance of Socio-Technical Transformations. And Professor Sheila Jasanoff invited us to be part of it, and we were quite happy to be involved. She works with the Kennedy School of Government and is the lead principal investigator of the entire project. And the other partners are from Germany, the Helmholtz Institute, from Africa, the African Center for Technology Studies, and we have from University of Sussex, the Science and Policy Research Unit. For the past year and a half, we have been looking at three major areas of research. One is the type of energy transformations, including the nuclear age, the transformation in terms of agriculture and what green revolution has done, and looking at the urban digital infrastructure and smart cities and those transformations. But when we were working together, we never imagined the kind of transformation we are now undergoing, and what a pandemic has done to the world and world order, so to say. So we felt that it would be helpful if we could take some of the type of learnings that we have got from there, but really ask Professor Sheila Jasanoff to go deeper into what this means for the world that is going to, evolve out of this. And we are quite grateful she readily accepted. And here we are in this room today. We'll be listening to her shortly. We have sent you a slightly longer introduction to this series. It will be every Friday at 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time. And we have speakers lined up for the coming Fridays. And before I introduce Professor Sheila Jasanoff, I just want to basically invite you to follow a certain set of rules which will help us all. Firstly, turn your cell phones on, and we hope that you are sitting in a very quiet space as much as you can manage. We would like you to turn off your audio. There's a little button on Zoom where you can mute yourselves so there is no disturbance of any sort. And if you would like to ask a question, there is a chat room. We prefer that you write the question down and we will invite you in. We'll read out your question. And once we run through those questions, if there is more time, we'll also have time for direct questions. But for that, you'll have to raise your hand. And there's a little button which says you can raise your hand. It's one of the functions of Zoom. So kindly use these functions to participate. And these are basically the rules we follow, so everyone is comfortable. And with that, I now invite Professor Sheila Jasanoff. Briefly, you probably read her bio, which we have given in the poster. But let me say that she's a pioneer of the science and technology studies. And for over decades ago, some of the kind of papers that she has written are so insightful and so very, she's seen a world before we could see it. And if you read her work, I think she has gone into many, many, many complex dimensions of decision-making that so many of us would be waking up to now. And it's basically the intersectionality of law, politics, how democracies function or they don't, and how science and technology shapes life and shapes the kind of worldviews that we have. These are some of the dimensions in which she has pioneered her work. And she's worked across the world. I invite you to read her bio, which is in the poster. And if you'd like to know more about her work, her website is sheilajasanoff.org. With that, I invite Professor Sheila Jasanoff to inaugurate this web talk series. She'll be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. I do know that she has an appointment soon after this in a meeting. And so this session will not be for 90 minutes. It'll be slightly shorter. So thank you all again. And thank you, Sheila, for accepting our invitation. And welcome again. And we look forward to your talk now.
Thank you very much, Leo. Is the sound check fine?
No.
Am I audible? Okay,
yes.
Great. So Leo and everybody else, I'm incredibly honored and also humbled to be asked to inaugurate this session, and for Leo in particular to be calling me a pioneer is a special honor, because to the extent anybody here is a pioneer, I think of Leo as that, whereas I'm just a mere academic doing my academic things. But what I want to talk about this, for me, it's early morning. For you, it's late afternoon. It's not so much the research that we've been doing together, although in the Q&A, if there are specific questions that people have, then obviously I would be happy to talk about it. I think that one of the features of the moment is that we have all been reduced in a sense to fundamentals, and what should we think about in those fundamentals. I think the title of this series, Imaginaries of a Resilient and Inclusive New World, they to some extent touch on our deepest hopes at the moment. So I thought that the best way I might open this discussion is with a series of personal reflections on the words in the title of the program. And then we can go deeper and in detail. And of course, there is evidence and there's literature and there's events in the world and things, the dots that we may wish to connect. But I'll leave that to the conversation as we get further into it. So just to give you a little sense of what Leo means when he says this is worldwide. I mean, so I'm sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in my house, which is about a 15-minute walk from the campus of Harvard University. And since March 13th, 6 weeks ago, all of us in Cambridge have been more or less in confinement. And for some of us, for even some of my students, it's actually solitary confinement because they're living in rooms or in small apartments where there isn't anybody. For me, it's fortunately not solitary because my husband and I share this house and we have each other to talk to and look after, but it's worth remembering that for many people, it is a much more isolating experience. And people have said that we should think of this as physical isolation, not social isolation. I think that that's meant to cheer us up, that we have resources. And of course, I'm incredibly double honored to be with all of you, that you have made time to be here with me this morning or afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. But many people don't have those resources, and it's a time of profound sadness and loneliness, you know, wherever people are in the world. And it's out of that sense of suddenly having all our infrastructures pulled out from under us that one has a chance to reflect. It's not, of course, all our infrastructures. I mean, you know, we find ourselves obsessively looking at the news and cycling through the major newspapers that we look at. And I'm not a particular YouTube fan, but you could go there. But what one sees is bleak or it's jarring. So in America, there are this picture after picture of highways with no traffic. And that's often being shown as an image of economies having come to a standstill. So nothing is being produced, things are not being transported, except, I suppose, by Amazon. Every day you read about new numbers of millions of people who are out of work in America. The unemployment funds are breaking down. You hear of people with limited food supplies, even in this country. The demand for people going to food banks has risen enormously. And yet at the same time, farmers are not being able to transport their commodities, and they're having to, in effect, throw milk down the drain. I mean, you know, I think this will become a universal trope, because I've read about in Calcutta, Mishtiwalas being forced to throw their milk down the drain. And the same is happening with American dairy farmers at the same time that people are going hungry and thirsty in some parts of the world. I mean, this is one of those scenarios that my colleague and country mate, Amartya Sen, described when he wrote about the famine. It is not that in Bengal, it's not that there is a shortage of food overall, but is it getting to the right places? And one hears of tragic and near tragic stories of people who are not getting the resources, even though they exist in other parts of the world. We've all seen pictures of dead bodies piling up, hospitals being unable to cope, bodies in the streets because the morgues can't handle the numbers of deaths. And of course, the actual number of identified deaths from coronavirus goes up every single day. So in America, just to give some perspective, that number is now, I think it has crossed 50,000 as of today. And 50,000 in a country of 330 million may not seem large, but keep in mind that that is more than the sum total of all of the traffic deaths in 1 year. And it is approximately the same range of numbers as lives lost in American lives lost in the entire Vietnam War. So we're talking about numbers that are not trivial. They're large by any standards. And in India, we don't know. I mean, I have the impression from talking to Leo and others that it's as if the whole country has drawn in a huge breath, but is unable to let it out, that people don't know what kind of situation we're in. And nobody knows, because the expert predictions keep fluctuating and changing. The one thing on which there are no predictions at all is even what happens to all of this situation we're in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month. Some countries are experimenting with what is being described as opening up the economy, but it's not just opening up the economy, it's opening up the form of life that we have suddenly been thrown into. And I will tell you that at my university, which is Harvard, we don't know what the next semester will look like. We don't know whether in September, Harvard is going to have a normal fall semester, or whether we will be forced to teach remotely. You know, I'm just not sure. Nobody understands, you know, what condition we'll find ourselves in even 2 or 3 months from now, let alone, you know, by the end of the year or in 2021. I keep thinking how ironic it is that we're in 2020, because 2020 has been taken as the indicator for perfect vision, and we're in the year 2020, but our vision is clouded. It is, you know, as if the whole world suddenly has cataracts, and we don't know what lies beyond. So this is a very strange time. It's a strange time in which to be reflecting on the words in the title of this webinar. So resilience and inclusiveness and imaginaries. So let me reflect a little bit on those words. So what gives us resilience? So in the pre-virus days, because I'm in relatively high demand as an academic, I used to jet around the world, and sometimes it meant that I was not at home, and I'm the caretaker of the plants in my house. I mean, so I water them and look after them. And last summer, we were away from my home in Cambridge for about 2 months. And when I came back, although we had had people coming into the house to water the plants, they were in much worse shape than when I look after them. But now I'm home, and I get to water them every week, and I also get to talk to them and do those other things that one does with plants. And there's a particular philodendron, very ordinary houseplant. It's usually very sturdy, but it had somehow stopped being as sturdy. I've had it for years, but it was looking much less full and much less healthy. But I'm finding that in the last few weeks, my philodendron is reviving. And, you know, maybe it's because I shine the light on it more and I move it around a little bit, and I'm definitely watering it regularly and so forth. So it's an example of a minor bit of resilience in my own life that I'm experiencing. And it makes one reflect. I mean, when you're in this kind of confinement, of course, things become not taken for granted. Everything that you do, you are reflecting on. The other day, I made a new little recipe. I made some pudina chutney, and I made some potatoes in pudina. So, you know, even sort of everyday acts like cooking are taking on a kind of new set of meanings, because you're experimenting with things you have. I mean, the last time I remember experimenting in this way was right after my first child was born, and he's going to be 50 this year. So it gives you some sense of, you know, being thrown back into the past to find the resources for the present and the future. So what makes my plant resilient, I think, is the root structure, that it was there and it was already strong and it is capable of putting forward new leaves. And so what I've been thinking about is, how do we regain that sense of rootedness in our own lives? You know, which are the roots that we need to tend to? And as Leo mentioned, we've been involved in this multi-country research project, India, Kenya, Germany, UK, and US. And in connection with that, of course, I've been coming to Bangalore a little bit. And the first time I came, the steel flyover controversy was going on at that time. But one dimension of that controversy particularly struck me because it is so central to environmental controversies, has been in India and is so also in other places. And that was the controversy of the trees that were supposedly going to be cut down in order to make room for the flyover. And of course, as some of you who live in Bangalore are well aware, that the city is known as a garden city. And so while I'm watering my own plants, I'm thinking of those amazing shade trees in Bangalore and the look of that city and how the city has this quality of rootedness. And in our research project, in all of the countries that I know well, that is India and Germany and the UK and the US, one of the ways in which people both really and symbolically have fought for resilience is through looking after other species, not just themselves. Even when I was an undergraduate, which is a long, long time ago, one of the big controversies around Harvard was that they had made plans somehow to cut down these sycamore trees that line the Charles River in our area. And I think it was the first example of a successful environmental controversy that I saw, even though environmentalism itself was not even a term at that time. So I entered into the field of environmentalism almost before it became a word. So to the extent that I have any claims to being far-seeing, it's not that, it's just that I was an early entrant. When I went to law school, there was no course in environmental law, but the first job I had was in an environmental law firm. So, we're talking about, some kind of phenomena that we need to go back to: caretaking, stewardship, these ideas that are the foundation stones of resilience. And we need to figure out, again, in some cases, this is relearning what makes for resilience. And one of the things that has come up in our conversations in the project is that this means the caretaking, the resilience means looking after ourselves, looking after our communities. That may be somehow straightforward, but it also means looking after the earth and the land in ways that we have become unused to. So in the environmental domain these days, there is this buzzword of the Anthropocene, and people are pointing out that we as human beings in the last couple of hundred years have created such an imprint on the world that you can't think of the world anymore in geological terms without thinking of us on the surface of the earth and what we have done. I was looking up some numbers the other day, and I found that just the sheer amount of concrete that we have poured onto the earth is something like 1 kilo for every square meter surface of the earth, whether it's water or whether it's land. I mean, so that is some measure of the imprint of the human imprint on the face of the earth. In connection with our research project, we went to visit the solar farm in Pavagada the last time that I was in Bangalore in January. And one of the things that Leo and Pargavi pointed out that has not left my imagination, and I want to come back to this idea of the imagination, is that for each of these solar panels we see, there is a kind of concrete root, if you will. And I mean, RWT, root. So these panels are resting where previously there was plants and vegetation, even if it was just grassland. But these roots are not generative. They have substituted a mineral for an organic. And I wonder what the resilience of a solar farm is as compared to the resilience of a grassland. And somehow I think that in this time, it is important for all of us in our own particular little circles of confinement where we have been thrown, even though we didn't want to be there, to reflect a little bit on the ecology of resilience that we're all implanted in. For me, I'm an academic, and part of that ecology is the teaching. And I find that one of the, it's not exactly a side benefit. It's almost like we've been thrown into a wartime emergency, mobilized in certain ways. But one of the things that I've been thinking of is new ways of connecting with those students. And I think that I've had more one-on-one conversations with more of my students this semester than I have in the typical time when I have office hours and people can come by for 15 minutes or whatever. Now, in a way, you're on perpetual office hours and people can write to you and you can make yourself available. I'm not sure that that is sustainable over time, because people can do that for a shorter period, but how much can you really cut yourself off to be in different places in different times? I was thinking today that there is technologically mediated a possibility that I've never had before. For some reason, today has become everybody's favorite webinar day. So in the morning at 7:30, for me, I am in a webinar in India. My next one will be in Cambridge, Massachusetts at 9 o'clock my time. This is why I have to leave a couple of minutes early. And then my next one will be at noon my time in Canada. So it is certainly possible to be in the same day in 3 completely different locations in the world, spread apart continents away. But it's also a kind of attenuated being. I mean, so it is not a being that is full, that is complete. You can't sit together with somebody and break bread and enjoy the moments of silence as well as the moments of talking in quite the same way. I am having to talk. This isn't a conversation. I will have to talk in a way continuously for a period of time to lay out for you some of what I'm thinking and only then hear back. But if this had been a conference, it would have been a different dynamic. We would have been sitting together in the same time zone. Pargavi asked me if I had had some nice coffee. If I'd been in Bangalore, I would have had some very nice coffee. And, there are these things that are just not possible to replicate in the virtual world. So I'm a student of science, technology, and society, and I put into my thoughts about resilience both the possibilities of technology, that is, I can be in India, Canada, and the US on the same day, hours apart, and the downsides of technology, that the version of me that is capable of being transported is a very pixelated, reduced, shallow, thin version, and the version of you that comes back to me is equally thinned out. Now, some of you I know from before, and therefore, when you come to me digitally, you are still, three-dimensional in some sense, but not everybody. So how does one think about inclusivity in this sort of era? I mean, in a way, Zoom has imposed a kind of inclusivity, but one of my colleagues with whom I co-teach a class was jokingly saying that our students have become postage stamps. You see the full Zoom screen and everybody is equivalent. Another joke that people have been making when I attend faculty meetings, they keep saying, oh, we never thought that we would get to see everybody's internal decorating habits in the way that we are suddenly seeing it. It is disconcerting. I was in a WHO, World Health Organization committee meeting. I was in it. It means I was virtually in it. But you know what an international society meeting would normally be. You would be sitting in an anonymous room and everybody would be wearing suits and ties if they were men and would be dressed in business attire. But here was this committee meeting and we were in people's living rooms, and it was an odd thing. But I think it also lent a kind of humanity, and I think it brought us behind the surface of organizations and gave this idea of bureaucratic rationality a different kind of meaning. And I wonder whether in our futures going forward, using the technologies, we could possibly cultivate a transparency that goes beyond paperwork and that goes beyond, well, the bureaucracy published its reasons or the Supreme Court handed down its reasons. Maybe we will be able to insist that people make themselves available to us as real people so that we get to see what lies behind. To some degree, we've been forced to do that as we meet the collectives in our everyday lives. And I wonder whether some features of this new enforced togetherness could be translated into the procedures by which we think together and we act together in the times to come. So when I think about inclusiveness, I also think historically. And in this country, there's now a mythology of a president that I myself did not much care for, and it's Ronald Reagan. He was no friend of the environment. He was Mr. Deregulator in chief. He is responsible for having undermined a great deal of the solidarity that existed in this country after the New Deal. But it's striking to remember that the one quotation that this man will be remembered for is his 1987 speech in Berlin, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I mean, Reagan didn't bring it about. We know that Maggie Thatcher actually pushed him on much of his foreign policy. I mean, you know, he himself was not a person of conviction, but nevertheless, that quotation has circulated. It has survived. And I think it has survived because it's something that humanity genuinely wants. We do not want walls. I was talking to a very good friend and colleague of mine yesterday. He teaches at Yale Law School, and he was saying that he had given a little seminar to his younger child's class, and these are first graders, and they were 6-year-olds, and they were talking about what they like and don't like about the world. And he said that the class had a consensus that when they come back, they want a world in which there is room for all of us. So this is a bunch of 6-year-olds, first graders in New Haven, who have already imagined a world of inclusiveness. And then last year, Angela Merkel came to give a talk at Harvard, and she referenced that quotation from Ronald Reagan, but she referenced it in relation to America. And although she didn't mention our president by name, it's clear what she was talking about when she said this: I want to leave this wish with you: tear down walls of ignorance and narrow-mindedness, for nothing has to stay as it is. But then we look around, and coronavirus has raised up walls between people in a way that was not the state of affairs a couple of months ago. So the very idea of quarantine is an idea about walls. We're stuck inside of our own houses. We're not able to go out. But the foreign policy of this country and of other countries, you know, even New Zealand, which is extremely progressive as a society in and of itself, the way that New Zealand has had to deal with its relatively well-managed COVID epidemic is by shutting the country, the island country, against visitors from elsewhere. And of course, in India itself, there is this extreme lockdown, and countries are refusing visas to people from other countries. Another friend of mine has a daughter who was going to go back from the US to her own country, but because the boyfriend was from somewhere else, they could not go back together to Germany, and they were forced to seek shelter somewhere else in America. So these kinds of things are happening. They're raising up walls between families, even within families, within communities, between communal groups. And in that kind of shutdown, lockdown, walled period, it is extremely easy to blame other people. So in this country, in America, we've seen this entire debate over where the virus comes from. But I have a Chinese student in my class that I've been teaching, and she was saying that in China, in a short period of time, most of her friends have become convinced that the virus comes from the US and not from China. So here are two super powerful countries, both with intensive research capabilities in the area of bioweapons, and both are accusing each other of having produced the virus. And one can say, well, these are fringe groups, these are conspiracy theorists. But I think conspiracies thrive in this period where we're living in walled isolation from each other. And it's a particularly difficult time in which to be thinking about this new world that we're being asked to imagine. What is the world of tomorrow going to look like? And how can we become more charitable towards one another? And I think that for that charity, it's important to put ourselves back in the kind of childlike imagination, if you will, of the 6-year-olds that I was talking about before, who are imagining that there will be a world in which there's room for every one of us. And I think that we are in such a world, but we have to figure out, how to build that world or rebuild that world. I think the idea that charity begins at home has never had so much meaning, but I also think that the idea of environmentalism, that you think globally but act locally, has never had so much meaning. We should be acting locally, but we can't forget that we are a planetary community, that this virus has united us in something that we already knew, that the roots of interconnectedness, even if they began in conquest and colonialism and all those bad things, have had the effect of shaping us into one humanity. The turn of the century mapping and sequencing of the human genome was a moment at which people acknowledged this. So I still remember the director of the Human Genome Program in America running through the major things that we had learned out of that project. And one of the things that he pointed out, his top #1 thing that we had learned, was how alike we all are, not just as the human species, but also as other species. So, people would point out that we share 70% of our genome with the mustard weed, and we share 99.9 something with any other human being, and even 99% with primates. So, it's well to remember that even through our knowledge and through our technologies, we've created a picture of humanity that must be together, that we are united and inclusive in some sense. But how we do that, how we translate that into the procedures of living together, that is going to take creativity, and that is going to take local creativity and thinking about that local creativity in ways that liberate us to also think on planetary scales. So that brings us around back to imaginaries. We have to imagine the world out there beyond today, because today by itself would be too depressing to think about. And are we capable of imagining? And of course we are. We know that sometimes in the darkest depths of the night, the imagination springs out. If you think of the political prisoners of the 20th century, like Nelson Mandela, they thought and imagined even when kept in solitary confinement. There's a very famous sonnet of Lord Byron, in which he imagines a prisoner in the castle of Chillon in Geneva, and he imagines how that prisoner walked and left imprints on the stone, and yet the imagination was free. And today we're seeing some rays of hope, in a sense, that may be the starting point for imagination. So even sitting here in America, I've seen numerous pictures coming from places in India and places in other places of the world that have known a great deal of pollution. And people are pointing out that in northern India, around Delhi in particular, people are seeing blue skies in a way that they had never been used to. So admittedly, we have been thrown into a shock. But Leo said that we're in a situation that we were not capable of imagining. And I wonder if that's exactly right, because many of the things that we're experiencing right now, people who are talking about environmental sustainability had already been imagining for a while. So much less burning of fossil fuel, much less flying in airplanes, much more local sourcing of food ingredients, much less consumption overall. So there are some features of this that absolutely are not sustainable and that are emergency measures. We've learned that we cannot turn down the world economy overnight and make it all come to a standstill and think that it is not going to affect people. It is affecting people drastically and extremely unhappily. And somehow we have to take care of that. These economies have to be started up. But can they be started up while retaining some aspects of the present moment? And what should those aspects be? And for me, this is a moment. So earlier this week was the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and last year was the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. So it's been a period of anniversaries. The thing that I remember most about the moon landing was the way in which the pictures that the astronauts brought back are part of the heritage that allowed us to build the world that we're in. It forced us to think in planetary terms. Back in 1972, when Indira Gandhi attended the Stockholm Conference on Environment and Development, it was the first time that a world leader had brought together the ideas of environment and economic development. So I think that in this moment when we're somewhat forcibly being made to think about nature in a different way, we should seize hold of that moment and try to get back some of the sense of imagination that we may have had at other times in the past. So I want to conclude this sort of prepared part of my remarks by also stressing that, you know, I am a product of the 20th century because I'm a hybrid. I live and I teach in America, but I remain in some deep sense a child of Bengal. And as you all know, if you're a child of Bengal, you were raised on Tagore, especially if you're in my generation. And there were imaginaries there. I mean, so when I think of my picture of the world, the ways in which I think of political action, the ways in which I think about inclusiveness, the ways in which I think of resilience, they're profoundly imprinted by the imaginaries of that period. So I just want to conclude with these words, which for an academic today, when we're confronted with acts of charity, yes, but also acts of divisiveness, I think where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depths of truth, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake.
Thank you so much, Sheila, and especially thank you for bringing Tagore in such a prophetic way and in a sense of hope as well, because despite the fact that we are now all walled up, somewhat willingly out of fear maybe, or for most people who don't have a choice, forced to be walled up. I think it's still, when you brought in a sense of hope, which we very much wanted. And I particularly liked how you said the childlike imagination that is so dynamic and extraordinary, and it's like looking through a kaleidoscope. I wish each of us had a kaleidoscope to look into now and forget the monochromatic world that we are now living in. Most of us stuck to, glued to television in some way or the other, despite the TV set being of some color variety. But the fact is the news is monochromatic in a large sense. So yes, thank you for giving us this hope. There are a lot of questions that have come in already, and I think it's best that we go into them. First question is by Satyaprakash Varanasi, a good friend and an architect in Bangalore. And he says, reference the climate crisis, not everyone was or was not able to individually contribute to mitigating the crisis. but the corona spread has been contained by individual actions, such as quarantine. This collective action also proves how resilient we can be. Sorry, there have been too many sufferings too, but do you foresee a possibility of such mass-scale individual actions to mitigate climate crisis?
Well, I mean, I think that the short answer to that is yes, because we've been forced to do it, and we see that people are doing it. But the thing is that it's at a huge cost. And I've been thinking about disasters and our responses to disasters for a very long time. So crisis and disaster is a topic in science and technology studies, and ever since 1984 and the Bhopal disaster, it's something that I've thought of on and off over every crisis that I've confronted. And the costs always fall disproportionately on the people who are least prepared. I mean, so if you don't have a home over your head, I mean, I don't know how many of my colleagues have said in academia that how fortunate we are because, we are getting our salaries put into our bank accounts and we have comfortable homes and, our food chains are not disrupted, the supply chain is not disrupted, people are still getting deliveries of various things through Amazon. I mean, this is, but what are we talking about? I mean, the top 1% of the world, I mean, it's what is happening with the rest of the people who were already living with all of the millions and millions of people, if not billions, who were already living on the edge. And, one of the things that I've been thinking about in connection with climate change for a long time is the long debate that has gone on about what is the ethical response to climate change, who should be cutting more and who should be cutting less. And as you know, there's been a tendency, particularly on the part of the field of economics, to make it very even, very flat. So a country is thought of as one unit and not the people within it as different kinds of units. Countries with different histories are still put on the same plane. And, there are country-specific contributions now. And to some extent, it's become a little bit more differentiated than it was before, but it's still the case that as a matter of global ethics, we have not internalized what we all know from the charitable side of our personas. We know that people who have more should give more, but this has not become a principle. And I think that I'm a little suspicious and a lot resistant, actually, to the idea that we say the connectivity or the collective action has to come through individual contributions, because to me it begs the question of distributive justice. I mean, how much is it fair or proper to demand from whom? And if we look at robust systems of justice, they have said that to some degree the people who can't afford it should not be made to pay for the things that other people have caused and created. So I think we have to take the lesson of today, which is, yes, collective action through a lot of individual actions is indeed possible and effective. I mean, you're perfectly right to pose that question, because with climate change, people have been saying for a long time, why should I individually do my bit? It's a drop in the bucket. There's nothing we can accomplish. There was a major case in the American Supreme Court where the government of the time, which was conservative, argued that we didn't have to regulate our motor vehicle emissions because it was a drop in the bucket and it wasn't going to contribute nearly so much as developing countries on their trajectories. And the court of that time, which was relatively a little bit more liberal, said, no, that is not a correct way of thinking about it. The correct way of thinking about it is that all of these contributions add up and therefore we should be doing it. But to me, it leaves open the question of how much sacrifice from each person. And that, I mean, so I think the two have to go together. Yes, how can we make, I mean, we've demonstrated in a way that a world of billions of individual actions will bring about certain kinds of reductions that we want. But, what about those jobless and what about those people who are going hungry? And, I think that this is something that as a policy matter, we're going to have to think incredibly long and incredibly hard about what is a good lesson and what is a false lesson to be taking away from now.
Thank you. Soumya has asked a question which builds on what you just shared in response to Satya's. And he says, any human society can be as resilient as the boundaries of their ecosystems to the extent to which it can take and not break. During these global shutdowns, especially of industrial and job creating activities, though not all, power systems, utilities still active, many ecosystems have shown a resilience and are rebounding in a very short time. Understood that this can't be continued, but in our understanding, what are the BAU type activities as industrial and or agrarian societies that we must abandon to have a long-term resilient society which is sustainable? And which society should and must start on corrective as well as E-linked courses of action?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I would be a prophetess, and I'm not. I'm just, a single human being who has by now seen quite a lot of things, but my own knowledge and imagination are limited. The thing I would say is that, when things are suddenly reduced to basics, it's also a good time for experimentation. And of course, the reason that I have so much enjoyed working with ESG and saw that as a huge benefit of this project we're involved in is that imagination is present in the NGO sector in a way that it is not necessarily present either in the institutions of government or in academia. And partly because the NGO sector often has had to operate in the interstices, in the margins, seeing, what is possible. In my own experience, although it may seem that I'm very well placed as an academic, at one of the top institutions of the world, I've actually been in those kinds of marginal positions, and intellectually, I've had to think creatively about how one brings a new discipline into being. But I suspect that any kind of experimentation like that, STS is a new field, and people in academia don't always like novelty, and they keep saying, there's nothing new here, you don't reserve resources, et cetera, et cetera. And, just to work on that, where does one find things? So the question began by saying that we're limited by our ecosystem, but I think that as far as imagination is concerned, we need to think what we mean by our ecosystem. It's quite obvious that in rich parts of the world today, if one looks at the ecological footprint of just the food that we eat and, other things that we do, our footprints extend way beyond the particular localities where we are. And I think that the sort of creative experimental instinct that asks us to redefine, what's essential and what's not essential, that is going to be a very important piece of the future looking forward. And one thing to point out is that we've undergone a kind of spatial revolution in recent times. So I mentioned, partly jokingly that I'm going to be present in Canada, India, and the US within the period of 5 hours or 6 hours today. So that is pretty amazing. But that it's just an indication of the digital revolution. And the digital revolution has brought with it ideas that you're all familiar with, like disruptive innovation. So in a sense, you could think of the moment that we're in as an enforced disruptive innovation. And, the people who invented corporate ideas like Uber and hence Ola as well, and also Airbnb, their claim was that there were unused resources lying around, which if we put them to use more efficiently, would help in solving some of the world's problems. So we have way too many cars per head in the population. That was the claim for America. And those cars are sitting around largely not being used. So can we think of some other ways to use those cars? And the idea was turn everybody into a taxi driver, and then you'll be more efficient and everybody will have transport because you can't rely on public transportation either. So anyway, it was in some ways a brilliant idea, but the idea has been around long enough that we also see the downsides. I mean, we see that sort of freeing up resources that were locked down may be a way to develop greater sustainability, but not if we fail to take care of people who were involved in the forms of life that went with the earlier use of resources. So throwing all taxi drivers out of work and raising suicides in those taxi driving communities, which has happened in America, is reminiscent to me of unlocking the genetic potential of plants and thereby interfering with farming forms of life and contributing in whatever way to the rise of suicides. It's as if, you know, with our technological imaginations and our entrepreneurial imaginations, we can see the nodes in the system where if you take out the blockage, you put in a stent in effect where there used to be a blockage, and now things are flowing quicker. But we've forgotten the entire system that had built itself around, you know, one way of thinking about life. And so I think innovation without charity is a very bad thing. And as we reimagine our ecosystems, I think we have to build back in a sense of systemic imagination and not a nodal imagination. And I think that technology innovators often lose sight of that systemic dimension, but I think those of us who work in communities of any sort are better equipped to think about those things. And I hope that that imagination will carry us forward, the communal imagination.
And that's the insight, I think, which we should probably spread a lot in the Bangalore tech community.
Yes, I agree completely.
Prakash Kaswan from Connecticut. Hi, Prakash. In moments of crisis, such as the one we are now in the midst of, there is an irresistible tendency to homogenize humanity and offer deeply apolitical reflections about the futility of human existence vis-a-vis nature. These reflections often paint a universally antagonistic relationship between nature and humanity. How does one counter these kinds of narratives and address questions of inequalities, and justice in our quest for a regenerative form of resilience?
Thank you, Prakash, and you're closer to me than Leo is at the moment, so I'm happy to talk to you. I mean, so what I was saying earlier about the ways in which people have imagined solutions to the world's problems speak directly to the point that you're raising, that many of our professional disciplines, like economics, like even political science to some extent, have become so individual-centered. I mean, that it's the only conception of togetherness that they have is you add up each person as if each person is a functioning cog in a machine, and that's the picture of totality. And what's missing there is the kind of thing that my Yale colleague James Scott wrote about when he wrote his book about the agrarian revolution in Southeast Asia called Weapons of the Weak. And he was talking about the fact that social organization matters, the kinds of ties that bind us to one another matter. One of the reasons that I'm in the field that I'm in and not in a field like economics is that I feel that my field allows me to think about exactly those questions of politics and inequality. How we deal with that, you know, it's up to each of us because we're embedded in very different places. I mean, for me, it has to do with teaching and training. And if you look at my scholarship, I think it's been devoted to something I hope you will appreciate, which is showing how things that look apolitical on the surface, like numbers or like risk assessments or whatever, that these are profoundly political at the foundations. And what I can do, because in the end, I'm an academic and a teacher, is use my analytic skills to show how what is profoundly political is being depoliticized and what the stakes are, what difference it makes. I'm not myself so much in the position, other than through teaching, I'm not so much in the position of crafting the solutions. But those of you who are building the alliances, I think it's a good time to be remembered that the intellectual world and the activist world really are not separate from one another. That being an intellectual, being a seeker after new ways of looking at problems is a form of activism. And I would certainly hope that one of the ways in which we might come out of the present period stronger, at least for a while, is, there's been a slogan about workers and students uniting and things like that. I mean, that the worlds of action and the worlds of thought ought to be closer together. If there's ever been a time for that closeness to happen, that time is now. And, I think that this webinar is an example of a kind of format that allows people from very different walks of life to talk to one another, to hear from one another, and, go away inspired. I mean, I am trained in law in an Anglo-American tradition, and that is a profoundly storytelling tradition because it depends on precedent, on the interpretation of precedent. And I think in my teaching, I bring in stories. So one way that I have of enriching the things that I talk to students about is through becoming more aware of what people are actually doing in different contexts. And, that kind of conversation makes my ideas much more accessible in a sense to people because they see how it actually plays out on the ground. So that's just one minor thing out of my own life about the ways in which you revive the political within the apolitical. And we have to fight the tendencies within our own forms of modernist intellectualism to produce the kind of flattening that you're talking about. But I think it's a collective enterprise, and we're each going to do it in a different way. For me, as I say, it remains the case that all of my work is directed toward showing where there are justice issues that people have not talked about, or there are distribution and politics issues that we need to keep in mind.
Thank you. I'll read out one more question and then I'll let Anjana Gurtu to raise the question through video. So this question is by Vandana Singh. She says, thank you very much for your powerful and inspiring talk. The communalization of the COVID-19 crisis is very disturbing and convenient for the powers that be, distraction from the same system that, through this destruction of the environment, makes pandemics and their spread more likely. The environmental movement in India can't ignore this dimension. Imagination is indeed crucial to creating the world we want. So how do we imagine our way out of the divisions that threaten to prevent our solidarity across class, caste, creed, religion, etc.? When the state has so much power especially, so that we can bring attention back to the socio-ecological crisis we face.
Well, I wish I had an answer, Vandana. I don't have an answer, but it is a moment for idealism. I mean, that is not losing hope. And, just before the virus crisis hit, one of the things I was hearing from all of my friends in India is how cheered up people were because they had gone through a period in September and October feeling pretty hopeless. And then the movements took hold, and the two things everybody was talking about, or there were three things that everybody was talking about: the youth of the people doing the moving, the leadership of women in those student-led movements, and the participation of a cadre of people that had not previously been involved. So I was struck how many different people said, the IIT students, they tend to be pretty apolitical normally, but they are engaged. So I think that, I think since the early part of the 20th century, really, we've not been living quite in fear of this particular catastrophe, but people have been imagining global catastrophe. That is, people have seen that we're too densely interconnected in some senses. In 1984, I think, Yale sociologist, wrote a book about tightly coupled systems and how they're not sustainable. He was writing about nuclear power, and how, you know, a breakdown in one part of the system will cause a breakdown to run through the entirety of the system. And globalization has become extremely tightly coupled. We saw it in 2008 in the financial sector, and today we're seeing it in the health sector. Climate change has been looming as something in the environmental sector. So, you know, the fact that all of us are connected in these ways and things spread like wildfire, this is something that we have foreseen. That people blame people, that crises are a moment when all the bad tendencies of a society can get promoted. That is also something that we've known for a long time. How do we counteract it? I think by being vigilant about the moment, by not being silent to the extent that it is in our power not to be silent, remembering that there's strength in numbers. So the individual dissenter has always been a morally powerful but politically weak figure. But that individual dissenter, I mean, a Gandhi or a Mandela can eventually gather groups around. I think we have to somehow uncover that bit of the Gandhi or the Mandela or the Martin Luther King within ourselves. We all have it to some smallish degree, I think, and use our own resources to do what we can. I mean, I sometimes find that my students and colleagues in this very rich university are often very fatalistic about what's possible. And I say to them that, you know, I come from the culture that has a reputation for fatalism. I think it's an incorrect reputation, because I think India has one of the liveliest NGO sectors of any society. We're maybe not as good as some other societies at building, you know, big lasting institutions out of that. But, you know, I think we have to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the very cultural context that we're in and keep reminding ourselves that, you know, I'm very fond of an English poet named Gerard Manley Hopkins, who wrote some poems about depression and what to do. I mean, he didn't call it that, but there's a line in one of his sonnets, you know, can something, hope, wish, day come, not choose not to be. And I keep remembering that line as a kind of motto or mantra, depending on how you want to, you know, not choose not to be. That's, I think, a very good lesson for all of us.
Thank you. I invite Anjula Gurtu. If you can hear me, can you unmute and raise your question?
Yes. Can you hear me? Can I?
Yes, you're
Okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Jasanoff, for this wonderful, insightful talk. My question is something that actually I was asked and I couldn't give an answer to. So the question is basically on the resilience of our ecology itself and our ecosystem. And so the question was that people are saying that the Earth is far more resilient than we think it is. And the examples are clearly in front of us when we see within 1.5 months of no travel and this lockdown, the rivers are already started looking cleaner. The pollution in Delhi, for example, has vanished. And so many other examples are there worldwide. So people are saying this, putting this whole thing about climate change and ecological resilience, and saying that the biggest problem that we have is not climate change, but rather redistribution of resources. And if it really takes 1.5 months of lockdown to resolve a lot of ecological issues, or at least start rejuvenating a lot of our ecological issues so fast, then maybe that is not the actual problem. The actual problem is more in the redistribution of resources that needs to be tackled. What would your view be?
Angela, thank you for that question. And as I think I've already told you, you should not stop referring to me as Professor Jasanoff all the time. But anyway, I'm just Sheila. Thank you for relaying the question as well. So, you know, there's one conceptual point that I would make, which is for a long time we made the conceptual error that we thought that humanity was different from nature, and there was somehow a line between humankind and the rest of nature. And then we started talking about ecosystems and ecologies and so forth, and that was a huge step forward in our thinking about human-nature relationships. But we shouldn't now think that the resilience of an ecosystem can be thought about without the resilience of the human beings either. And of course, you know that very well, but it's worth pointing out that, you know, talking about rivers running free is not particularly helpful or even beautiful if people are dying in droves because they have no access to water, they have no access to food. So the huge challenge is that we live in a very heavily populated world in which, as you point out, resources are unequally distributed. And resilience has to mean not just the resilience of all of the parts of nature that are not human, but to create a form of resilience in which humans and nature are going to live together in some sense without drastic dislocations for many, many millions of people of the sort that this crisis has brought about. So somehow we need to get back to a more incremental imagination of how to put the pieces together. So I'm hopeful that some things may last. I mean, you know, if you are indeed 6 years old and went through this experience, or you're 17 years old and you went to college and you've gone through this experience, or 22 about to graduate from college and gone through this experience, you will remember it. And what are the things that you should remember? I think partly, who are the people who have thought about a world in which some of our uncontrollable appetites could be controlled more? I mean, so I think Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, is going to have a different kind of resonance, but smallness of what? And I think that the restraining of the appetite, that is something, and I'm not just talking about eating and drinking, although there too, one might think a little harder, but just, you know, how much travel is necessary, how much not. I think even corporations will have come to the conclusion that maybe that they had gone overboard in some sense. So ecological resilience to me cannot be meaningful unless it also has human resilience built into it. But I think that for humans to understand more deeply things that may just have been abstractions, I mean, like what is a footprint, what is an ecological footprint, I think that we will have different stories to tell. And I think people may go through a kind of, you know, moral self-examination. By the way, Leo said glued to the television, and I'm afraid that that immediately conjured up to me one of the headline stories in the New York Times today about a certain figure in the White House who was sitting glued to a television. So I don't believe that everybody is going to go through this moral regeneration point, but, you know, if enough people do to come away with a different sensibility of humans in nature and nature around humans, I think we will have made a huge step forward.
Thank you.
Sheila, I just wanted to say that for your next appointment, you have 15 minutes. So can you take some more questions, or how do you feel? You can
maybe one or 1.5.
Okay, all right. That's a challenge because we have 18 questions waiting. We'll send you the questions later, and hopefully you'll have time to, you know, just speak into a microphone, and we'll put it on our website later, so that all the questions.
Yes, let's arrange that for later, and we'll figure out a way.
Sure. So this is from Abhishek Tiwari, and he says the climatic crisis, as I understand, hasn't been caused by humans, but by unforeseen second and third order effects of high energy use lifestyle of the top 5%. Even if 95% humans stop being wasteful, the problem persists given the autonomy that high density energy brings. How can we stop the monkeys with superpowers?
Well, I think I was speaking a little bit about that already, about curbing the appetites of the top 5%. You know, this will have been an object lesson. So I really don't want to overclaim in any sense. I mean, I only see little bits and pieces, but you know, to all of the people who have said it is not possible to get people to do this, that, or the other thing, we have shown that it is possible to do this, that, or the other thing. That is, it is possible to curb appetites. It is possible to live without, you know, certain kinds of travel. It is possible to clear the skies over Delhi. I am saying that the costs of this sudden transition are not sustainable because they have fallen in overly burdensome ways on those who are already vulnerable, because some of these costs are simply too high to bear for anybody. You cannot just bring an economy to a standstill, but we also are restarting economies, and above all, we're restarting the topic of the seminar, the imagination. I mean, what I was saying at the very early part of my talk is that enforced confinement is a good prescription. I mean, for people who've been in prison or people who've been put in solitary confinement forcibly because of the virus, it is a time to rethink these very basic questions of what do we value, you know, what do we care about? One of the reasons why the governor of New York State, who was not exactly a cuddly, lovey-dovey person, Andrew Cuomo, has emerged as such a hero is that he's turned out to be able to weave together the personal experience with the collective. That is, he is able to talk about his 80-something-year-old mother and his late father and tell stories about them in connection with what we all should be doing. So if Andrew Cuomo actually emerges out of this crisis as a more humanitarian figure, that is the sort of thing that gives me hope. I mean, that is, it's possible for people to rethink, you know, connections. And I think that the nature of our connections, whether it's to the ecosystem or to each other or to our communities or globally, those are the places where we have to, you know, think of obligation and responsibility as well. And I'm hopeful that those top 5% will have learned something. We can't write them off as hopeless.
I guess, yeah, the next question actually speaks to that reality. And let me ask this. This is Paran Amitava. He says, I've been seeing the blue skies in Delhi due to the shutdown of factories. But unfortunately for India, most of the working class works in spaces which add harm to the nature, which harm nature. Restoring nature cannot be at the cost, obviously, of human lives. You have alluded to, you know, the clean rivers and all that. Rather, it must not be, since humans are as much a part of the whole. Nevertheless, how does one create jobs which are both good for the ecosystem and for the people? And that would also mean in terms of distributing wealth and ensuring the top 5% don't, you know, take 85% of the world's wealth.
Well, so
and I would also say this should be the last question, so you can.
Yeah, I think that this has to be the last question. And again, I have to plead that I don't have any final answers. But, you know, an economy functions on a great deal of artifice and itself a great deal of imagination and a great deal of fiction making. We end up valuing some things and not valuing other things. In America, it's well known that we've built an economy of planned obsolescence. I know, for instance, in my own life that, you know, I still use the hand mixer that I bought when we first got married, and that's a very long time ago. But if I bought a mixer now, it would last me much less time. My appliances that I buy now give out in 10 years, whereas before it was a 20 or 30-year lifespan. And back in those days, we had more resilient economies in a sense because we weren't using resources at that sort of rate. So there are particular fields of academic thought, like economics, that I think have taken a totally wrong turn by assuming that perpetual growth is the thing that we should be striving for, whereas, you know, likely we should be striving for much more of an equilibrium model. And it's obvious that in that equilibrium model, not endless growth, but something that is more like the Gaia hypothesis in positing that things have to be in some kind of dynamic harmony all the time with each other, you know, the kind of inequality that one very thin slice of the Earth's population benefits at the expense of everybody else, that is obviously an idea that has got to go. But that is a political idea. So, you know, I think many of the questions have been about ecology and resilience in nature, but we shouldn't forget that the way we human beings have constructed our relations with each other as political entities, as political actors, and as societies, that this is all important. And, you know, to the extent, I think that America, because of its wealth, has become a little bit apolitical in its imagination. We think that the right solution is, you know, impose efficiency the way that American institutions think of efficiency. And I've always thought that my colleagues and friends in India were far more politically savvy in some ways than we have become. But there are signs of regeneration here too. And so I think the last words I'll say for now are that this is a moment at which to rethink human nature relationships for sure, but it's also a moment to rethink what kind of politics should we have and what is a regenerative politics that will regenerate our societies out of this kind of crisis. Equality, the striving for equality, it's been part of the great thinkers of politics for eons, and that is something we have to recover and try to re-articulate in the ways in which we hold our city governments accountable, our state governments accountable, our national governments accountable, and our global institutions accountable. But for that, it's not just me. I'm just a tiny cog in the entire machinery of activism and activist thought. And I really, really, really appreciate the chance to spend a little bit of time with all of you and listen to your questions. And, you know, hopefully this is just the beginning of a conversation. It's on Leo and Bhargavi's part, the beginning of a series, so that's wonderful. But I think there are also many individual conversations that need to be had in groups, and I look forward to doing my little bit to add to those things.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And I must say that you know, you alluded to the metaphor of the cataract, the whole world as a cataract. I don't think we had a cataract when we started listening to you. I can see much clearer, and I can see with a sense of positive energy and hope, because this series is really about that. It's not about going back to gloom and doom and those scenarios, because, you know, we are a resilient being, having survived on this planet with trillions of viruses, and why should we dare worry about just one? So that said, I hope the other aspect is that we are not interacting with each other as postage stamps, because postage stamps don't interact. But certainly when the lockdown is lifted, I'm sure that we have built enough of an imagination to overcome the type of pressure the state is putting on us individually and as communities, because I think that is not just a bit too much, it's not just a little overbearing, or too overbearing is not even the word, it's just so harsh. And I think there could have been a different way, and that we could have dealt with it all, a different imagination, which this, as you rightly said, the state lacks. So again, thank you very, very much on behalf of everyone who's participated, and I thank all the participants for making this such a very, very intense, but also very, very rich experience. And I also want to invite you all to join the next web talk. This will be by Niloufar Kok. She's an Armenian, but she now lives in Germany, but she's a Kurdish person, and she's the co-chair of the Kurdish National Congress. And that will be at the same time next Friday. And finally, I want to thank Joe from Center for Financial Accountability and the group itself for extending their Zoom connection so that we could actually meet from 5 different continents. People have participated. So thank you. Thank you all, and thank you, Sheila, particularly. And thank you for, you know, accommodating an early morning conversation. It's a really, really, Bhargavi will send you a coffee.
Thank you so much, Leo. Wonderful to be with you. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.